Japanese billionaire CEO wrote, "Help on a napkin." What the black waitress did next shocked everyone. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. It was a quiet evening in one of the most exclusive restaurants in downtown Tokyo. The atmosphere was calm, with soft jazz playing in the background and the smell of fine cuisine drifting through the air. The elegant setting was a haven for the wealthy and influential, a place where deals were made and connections forged over gourmet meals. But that night, in the midst of it all, an unlikely scene was about to unfold. At a corner table near the window, the Japanese billionaire CEO, Hiroshi Takeda, sat with his business associates. He was known for his sharp mind, his commanding presence, and his ruthless approach to business. His company, Takeda Technologies, was one of the most powerful tech firms in the world, and Hiroshi himself was a titan in the industry. But tonight, something was off. His usual confidence was absent, replaced by a look of unease that his companions couldn't quite place. As the evening progressed, Hiroshi's discomfort became more apparent. He kept glancing nervously at his watch, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. His associates, deep in conversation, seemed oblivious to the growing tension that was radiating from him. Hiroshi had received a threatening message earlier that evening. Someone had discovered his darkest secret, a secret that could unravel everything he had built. He was being blackmailed, and there was no way out. His mind raced as he tried to think of a solution, but it seemed like he was out of options. That was when it happened. In the middle of a conversation about a new business deal, Hiroshi suddenly reached for the napkin on the table, grabbed a pen, and scribbled something down. His hands were trembling as he wrote the words, "Help." He pushed the napkin toward the edge of the table, hoping that someone would notice. But there was a problem. No one at the table was paying attention. Hiroshi's associates continued to talk, their voices growing louder as they discussed profits and partnerships. Hiroshi's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that no one was going to help him. In that moment, he was completely alone. But little did he know, there was one person in the room who had been watching the entire time. A young black waitress, Amara, moved silently between the tables, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. She had worked at the restaurant for a few months now, and while she was used to serving the rich and powerful, she always kept a low profile. She had seen how they treated the staff, with disdain, with impatience, as if the waiters and waitresses were invisible. Amara had learned not to expect kindness. But something about Hiroshi's situation caught her attention. She had been passing by when she noticed the napkin with the word, "Help," written on it. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the fear in his eyes. For a moment, she hesitated. But then, without thinking, she walked over to the table, her footsteps soft but deliberate. She stood by Hiroshi's side, her eyes scanning the room to make sure no one was watching. In that split second, something inside her shifted. She had always been taught to keep her head down, to do her job, and not to interfere with the affairs of the wealthy. But this was different. She couldn't just ignore the plea for help sitting right in front of her. "Sir," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Hiroshi looked up, startled. His eyes widened as he saw the young waitress standing there, her expression calm but determined. She had noticed. She had seen his distress. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The room around them seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of them in the spotlight. Amara took a deep breath, and with a quiet confidence, she spoke again. "You're not alone," she said, her voice carrying a weight that Hiroshi couldn't ignore. And with those words, the world shifted. Amara didn't know it yet, but her decision to act in that moment was about to change everything for Hiroshi Takeda, and for her as well. Amara stood there for a moment, watching Hiroshi's face as he processed her words. His eyes, still wide with shock, searched her face for something. Maybe for assurance, maybe for a sign that she could be trusted. In the silence of the moment, the world around them seemed to slow down. The restaurant continued its business as usual, unaware of the quiet tension that hung in the air. The jazz band played softly in the corner, the clinking of silverware on fine china, the only sounds breaking the stillness between them. Hiroshi finally spoke, his voice low, hoarse, as if every word took effort. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his gaze never leaving hers. Amara didn't hesitate. She had always known that her job was to serve, to be invisible, but this time, something inside her had shifted. "Because everyone deserves help, no matter who they are," she said quietly. Hiroshi seemed to absorb her words, his brow furrowing in confusion and disbelief. "But I'm the one who's supposed to be helping. I'm the one who controls everything," he muttered under his breath. Amara didn't respond immediately. She simply offered him a small, steadying smile, and then spoke again. "Sometimes, it's not about control. Sometimes, it's about being human." Hiroshi leaned back in his chair, still trying to process what was happening. The power dynamic he had always relied on, his wealth, his status, felt suddenly irrelevant in that moment. For the first time, he was no longer the one calling the shots, but the one in need. Amara moved away briefly, only to return with a glass of water, which she handed to Hiroshi with gentle care. As he took the glass, his eyes flickered to the napkin where he had written help. It felt like an eternity ago, yet the urgency of that single word still hung in the air. Amara's act of kindness had broken through the walls of pride he had spent a lifetime building. Hiroshi's mind raced as he remembered the phone call that had started it all. His world had been spinning out of control for the past few days, and now, with the storm of uncertainty swirling around him, it was a waitress, a young woman he barely knew, who had given him a lifeline. He had received a cryptic warning earlier in the day, something about a scandal that threatened to ruin his company and his career. It had been an anonymous message, but it was enough to send him into a panic. As the day went on, things only got worse. Someone was threatening to expose him, to bring down everything he had worked for. At first, he had dismissed it as a hoax, but now, sitting in front of Amara, he realized just how real it was. The people behind the threats weren't playing games. They had connections, they had power, and they were closing in. But here he was, a man with billions in the bank, feeling utterly helpless in the face of something far more powerful than money. Amara's presence in that moment was the only thing keeping him from spiraling completely. Her calm demeanor, her willingness to help without asking anything in return, was like a beacon in the storm. "I don't know what to do," Hiroshi admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to know everything right now," Amara replied. "Sometimes, the first step is just asking for help. And you've done that." Hiroshi felt a knot in his stomach. He had never been in a position where he had to rely on someone else, much less someone like Amara, who, to him, had always been just another face in the crowd. Yet here she was, offering him hope, offering him something he hadn't known he needed. In that moment, he realized that power wasn't just about wealth or influence. It was about the ability to connect with others, to share vulnerability, and to trust when things seemed hopeless. Amara looked around the room, noticing that no one had paid attention to the quiet exchange between her and Hiroshi. The rich, powerful guests continued to drink their wine and discuss business, unaware of the life-changing moment that had just unfolded between the two of them. But for Amara, it wasn't about them. It was about Hiroshi, and in a strange way, it was about herself, too. It had taken her a long time to learn to stand her ground, to fight for what was right, even when it seemed like no one would notice. But tonight, something had changed. She hadn't just served a meal. She had given a man the chance to reclaim his humanity. As Hiroshi slowly stood up, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, he turned to Amara with a look that was both grateful and defeated. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've given me more than just help. You've given me hope." Amara smiled softly. "Everyone deserves a chance," she replied. And with that, the world outside the restaurant seemed to fade away. For the first time in what felt like forever, Hiroshi Takeda wasn't the CEO of a powerful empire. He was just a man, sitting across from a stranger who had changed everything. The storm outside had passed, but a new storm was beginning to brew, one that would force Hiroshi to face the consequences of his actions, and one that would test Amara in ways she had never imagined. In the following days, Hiroshi found himself trapped in a whirlwind of decisions that would shape not only his future, but also his perception of the world. The powerful CEO, who once saw the world as something to be controlled, now felt like an outsider, unsure of the next step. Every move he made seemed to be shadowed by the reality of the threats looming over him. The blackmail, the threats to his company. It was all too much to handle alone. But the one thing he knew for sure was that Amara had given him something invaluable, a lifeline. The kindness she had shown him, without asking for anything in return, had sparked something within him that he could not ignore. As he sat at his desk in the office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, his phone remained silent. He had always prided himself on being a decisive leader, but now, every decision felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was his assistant, looking more nervous than usual. "Mr. Takeda, there's someone here to see you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Hiroshi frowned, confused. He wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" he asked. It's Amara, the waitress from the restaurant," she replied, hesitating before adding. "She says she has something important to discuss." Hiroshi's heart skipped a beat. Amara? Why would she be here? He had barely processed her words when she stepped into the office. She looked the same, composed, confident, but there was something different in the way she carried herself now. She wasn't just the waitress from the restaurant anymore. She was someone with a purpose. "Mr. Takeda," Amara began, her voice steady and calm. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I think I can help you." Hiroshi looked at her, surprised. "Help me," he repeated, his voice low. "How?" Amara took a deep breath, then spoke in a way that only someone who had seen the darker side of life could. "I know about the people who are threatening you," she said. Hiroshi's eyes widened. "How could you know?" "I overheard some things," she explained. "And I know how these people work. I've seen their tactics before. They're dangerous." Hiroshi felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the tough decisions. But now, here was Amara, someone he had barely known, offering him help. It was a humbling moment. He swallowed hard, trying to collect his thoughts. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted. "I don't even know if you can help me." Amara nodded, as if she had anticipated his doubt. "I understand. But I know you don't have many options left." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "These people, they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. But you can't face them alone. You need allies, and right now, I'm the only one who can help." Hiroshi looked at her for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the image he had built up of the world, one of power, control, and wealth. It was hard to admit, but he realized she was right. He was alone in this fight. He had spent his entire life building a fortress around himself, but now it felt more like a prison. "What do you want in return?" Hiroshi asked, his voice cautious. Amara didn't hesitate. "Nothing. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. You're not the only one who's been underestimated. I've been there too. And I'm not going to let these people ruin your life or mine." Hiroshi was taken aback by her words. She spoke with such clarity, such conviction, it was impossible not to believe her. He had no idea what to say, so he simply nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll trust you. But how do we stop them?" Amara smiled, a glimmer of confidence in her eyes. "First, we need to gather information. Then we'll expose them. But we'll need to be careful. These people are well connected, and they won't go down easily." Hiroshi felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Amara was offering him a chance to fight back, to take control of his own future once again. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least he had someone who understood what it meant to fight against the odds. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you." Amara shook her head. "You don't have to. Just promise me one thing. You won't give up. You don't have to be the hero. Just be human." Hiroshi nodded, a new resolve forming within him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to face it alone. Together, he and Amara would fight to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. It was time to take back control. In the following days, Hiroshi and Amara's plan began to take shape. Although the path ahead was far from simple, Hiroshi had always operated in a world where power and influence were his weapons. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, he found himself stepping into unfamiliar territory, a territory where trust and vulnerability mattered more than money or reputation. Together, they began gathering the necessary information. Hiroshi had an army of assistants, lawyers, and investigators at his disposal, but it was Amara's knowledge of the streets, Her understanding of how people with power could hide behind their connections, that gave them the edge. It wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about outsmarting those who thought they were untouchable. They met in secret, away from the eyes of Hiroshi's usual circle. At a small, dimly lit cafe, Amara passed on key information she had overheard, things Hiroshi's high-end security team had missed. She had learned to pick up on the smallest details, the conversations that were never meant to be heard, the little slips of information that others would never pay attention to. Hiroshi, in turn, shared his contacts, opening doors that Amara never would have been able to access on her own. It was an odd partnership, one that bridged worlds that rarely collided. As the days went by, they realized the extent of the danger they were facing. Hiroshi's blackmailers weren't just criminals looking to make money. They were part of a larger web, a network with deep connections in both business and politics. Amara's instincts had been right all along. They weren't just dealing with thieves. They were up against the kind of people who played the game by different rules. But Hiroshi wasn't willing to give up. The more he worked alongside Amara, the more he began to admire her. It wasn't just her intellect. It was her strength, her refusal to back down in the face of adversity. Hiroshi had been used to commanding respect through his wealth, but Amara commanded it through her actions, through her resolve. One night, as they sat in the small office Hiroshi had set up for their meetings, Amara placed a stack of documents in front of him. "This is everything we need," she said, her eyes focused, her voice steady. "But we can't go to the authorities yet. We need to be sure, and we need to do it carefully. These people won't hesitate to make you disappear." Hiroshi nodded, the weight of the situation settling deeper into his chest. He had been playing a dangerous game with his career, his company, and his future. Now, that game had grown even more perilous, and the stakes were higher than ever. He could feel the pressure of his past decisions weighing on him. But it wasn't just his own future at risk anymore. It was Amara's, too. "What's the plan now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Amara took a deep breath. "Now, we play their game, but on our terms," she said, her eyes narrowing with determination. "We'll expose them, but we do it when they least expect it. And we'll make sure they know who we are." Hiroshi watched her closely, impressed by her confidence. There was something about Amara that made him believe they could win. For the first time in days, Hiroshi allowed himself to hope. The plan they were about to set in motion would not only change his life, it would change the lives of everyone involved. But it was more than that. It was about redemption. Hiroshi had spent his entire life building an empire, but now, for the first time, he was fighting for something that mattered more than money or status. He was fighting for justice, for the truth, and for Amara. The next day, they met again, this time in a different location, a more discreet place, far from the watchful eyes of Hiroshi's inner circle. Amara had arranged a meeting with a journalist who had been following the corruption trail for months. The journalist was skeptical at first, unsure whether to trust a billionaire like Hiroshi. But Amara's words and the evidence she presented were enough to sway him. As the meeting came to an end, the journalist agreed to publish their story, complete with the proof they had gathered. Hiroshi's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of what they were about to do settled in. The truth would be exposed. The powerful figures behind the blackmail would be held accountable. And in that moment, Hiroshi realized that, despite all the wealth and power he had accumulated over the years, it was his integrity, his courage, and his willingness to do what was right that would define him. The story they were about to tell would change everything. And Hiroshi knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, that they were ready. The day Hiroshi and Amara had been preparing for finally arrived. The journalist had agreed to publish their story, and they had secured enough proof to make a significant impact. It was time to expose the powerful figures who had been manipulating everything from the shadows. But neither of them knew just how far the web of corruption reached, or how dangerous the people they were about to confront could be. As they sat in the office, preparing for the final steps, Hiroshi felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He had spent years building his empire, fighting for control, but this was different. This wasn't about business deals or market shares. This was about something far bigger, justice. Amara, sitting across from him, seemed calm as ever. She had seen much more of the dark side of life than Hiroshi could imagine. For her, this wasn't just a fight for the truth. It was personal. As much as Hiroshi knew he couldn't do this alone, He couldn't shake the feeling that Amara had something deeper driving her. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and now, she was about to change the game. Hiroshi's phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from the journalist. It's ready. The story's going live in 1 hour. Hiroshi stood up, his mind racing. 1 hour. In that hour, everything could change. The power he had once wielded so effortlessly could slip away in an instant. But so could the truth. He turned to Amara, whose eyes met his with quiet understanding. Are you sure about this? He asked. She nodded. We don't have a choice anymore. The truth needs to be heard. Hiroshi felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly replaced with a resolve that surprised even him. He had lived in a world where success was defined by wealth and status. But now, as he stood on the brink of something far bigger than his business empire, he realized that his life had been about something else all along. Amara had shown him the importance of doing what was right, not what was easy. The seconds seemed to stretch as they waited for the story to be published. Hiroshi's heart was racing, but his mind was clear. This was it. The moment that could define the rest of their lives. The moment that could bring down the men who had threatened him, and those like them. But as the hour passed and the story went live, something unexpected happened. Rather than a flood of media attention, the story was met with a strange silence. Hiroshi's stomach tightened as he refreshed his phone's news feed, hoping to see the headline. But instead, there was only a message. It's been pulled. His heart sank. Someone had already intervened. The media had been silenced. But Hiroshi wasn't ready to give up. He turned to Amara, who had also seen the message. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were burning with determination. This isn't over, she said, her voice steady. They think they can stop us, but we'll find another way. Hiroshi couldn't help but admire her resilience. In that moment, he realized just how much she had changed him. She had given him the courage to face the truth, to confront the people who had spent years manipulating the world. And now, it was time to fight back. They quickly devised a new plan. Instead of relying on the traditional media, they would go directly to the people. They would use the internet, social media, and any other platform they could find to get the story out. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only option left. In the days that followed, Hiroshi and Amara worked tirelessly, organizing online campaigns, reaching out to independent journalists, and making sure their story reached the widest audience possible. The more they pushed, the more they realized the depth of the corruption they were facing. Powerful people, powerful organizations, had their hands in everything. But with every step they took, the truth began to spread. People were starting to listen. Hiroshi's company, Takeda Technologies, had been under the microscope for years, but now, it wasn't just about business. It was about something bigger, accountability. The first signs of change came slowly, but they came. More and more people started questioning the status quo. The corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for so long was finally being exposed. And with that exposure came a shift in the power dynamics. Hiroshi's name was no longer just a symbol of wealth and success. It was becoming a symbol of resilience, of fighting back against the system. But as Hiroshi and Amara continued their fight, they knew the real battle was just beginning. The people they were up against would stop at nothing to maintain their power, and Hiroshi was no longer just fighting for his company. He was fighting for the future, for a world where the truth mattered more than money, where justice could be served. As the story gained momentum, Hiroshi and Amara's bond grew stronger. They were no longer just allies. They were partners, fighting together to bring about change. Hiroshi couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come in such a short time. He had started as a billionaire CEO with everything to lose, but now, he was ready to risk it all, for the truth. As Hiroshi and Amara continued their battle, things started to escalate. Their story had gained traction, and while many people were rallying behind them, the forces they were fighting against were not going to back down quietly. The individuals who had been involved in the corruption were powerful, influential, and used to getting what they wanted. But for the first time, they were up against something they couldn't control, the truth. As more details came to light, Hiroshi's past was dragged into the spotlight. The media, even the independent outlets that had picked up their story, began questioning everything about him. His leadership, his company, his morals. The public wanted answers, and they weren't going to stop until they got them. Hiroshi felt the weight of it all. He had been a successful CEO, commanding boardrooms, making high-stakes decisions, But now he was being forced to answer questions about things that were not just about business. They were about his personal integrity. But amidst all the noise, one thing stood clear. He had made a choice to fight for the truth. Amara, ever calm and resolute, remained his anchor. She was a constant reminder of why they had started this journey in the first place. She didn't care about the public opinion or the headlines. She cared about justice, about seeing the people behind the corruption held accountable. But the path they were walking was far from smooth. As they gathered more evidence and exposed the network behind the blackmail, things began to get dangerous. Late one night, as they were going through documents in Hiroshi's office, they heard a knock at the door. A loud, insistent knock. Hiroshi immediately stood up, his heart racing. He knew it wasn't anyone from his usual circle. This was something else. He motioned for Amara to stay quiet as he crept to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. But there was a small envelope wedged under the door. Hiroshi opened it cautiously, pulling out a single sheet of paper. It was a warning. A clear message: stop or else. Hiroshi's hands trembled as he read the words. He knew this was only the beginning. The people behind this were getting desperate. They had already tried to discredit him in the media, but now it was personal. They were threatening him directly. Amara looked over at him, her face hardening when she saw the paper. "We knew it was coming," she said quietly. "They won't stop until they're exposed, and they'll do whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen." Hiroshi swallowed hard, trying to push back the fear that had crept up on him. "What do we do now?" Amara didn't hesitate. "We keep moving forward," she said, her voice steady. "We expose them, and we make sure the truth comes out. The more they try to silence us, the more people will listen." Hiroshi nodded, his determination reigniting. He wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything they had been through. Not after everything he had learned about the real meaning of power. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. Hiroshi and Amara dug deeper, using every connection they had, every resource available, to gather even more evidence. But the threats kept coming. They found their phones tapped, their email accounts compromised, and even their security systems hacked. It was clear that the people behind the corruption were pulling out all the stops. But Hiroshi was no longer the man who cowered under pressure. He had been humbled, yes, but he had also grown stronger. With Amara by his side, he felt like they had a chance. As the pressure mounted, Hiroshi finally made the decision to take his fight public in a way they hadn't planned. Instead of just releasing another statement or going through official channels, they went directly to the people, through a live-stream video. In the video, Hiroshi and Amara laid everything bare. They exposed the web of corruption, named the people responsible, and showed the world what had been happening behind closed doors. It was risky, but it was their only option. And as the video went viral, something unexpected happened. People started standing up. The public wasn't afraid of the powerful anymore. Hiroshi's actions, and Amara's courage, sparked something. People were sharing the video, discussing it in public forums, and demanding accountability from those in power. The forces that had once been untouchable were now facing the kind of scrutiny they had never imagined. Hiroshi had given up his reputation, but in return, he had gained something much more valuable. The truth was no longer something to be hidden. It was something to be fought for. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that the corrupt network they had exposed was crumbling. Lawsuits were filed, investigations were launched, and key players were brought into the light. Hiroshi knew that it wasn't over yet. There would be more battles to fight. But in that moment, standing next to Amara, he felt like he was finally on the right side of history. They had started this journey together, and now, they were about to change everything. As the weeks passed, the effects of Hiroshi and Amara's decision to go public began to ripple through every corner of the world they had once occupied. Hiroshi's company, Takeda Technologies, which had been the pinnacle of his life, was now under constant scrutiny. The public's attention was focused on the powerful figures who had been involved in the corruption, and the walls that once protected them were starting to crumble. Hiroshi had expected pushback. He had expected resistance from the people he had once considered allies. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. His world was changing faster than he could process. The board members who had once praised his vision were now turning their backs, publicly distancing themselves from him as the media continued to report on the scandal. His name, once synonymous with success, was now becoming a symbol of everything that was wrong with the corporate world. But Hiroshi wasn't alone. Amara was by his side, unwavering in her support. She had been the driving force behind their strategy, the one who understood how to navigate the world of power and corruption. And now, as the truth continued to unravel, it was her strength that kept them moving forward. Despite the public backlash, Hiroshi knew there was no turning back. The evidence they had exposed was too significant to ignore, and the people behind the corruption weren't going to stop until they had silenced him. But Hiroshi was no longer the same man who had once used his wealth and influence to control everything around him. He had learned that true power didn't come from money or status. It came from standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. The media was relentless in its coverage of the scandal. But the more they pushed, the more Hiroshi and Amara pushed back. They knew the risks. They knew that the people they were up against had the resources to make their lives miserable. But the truth was their weapon, and they were determined to use it. Amara had become a symbol of resilience. Her story, the story of a woman who had been underestimated and disregarded, resonated with people across the world. As Hiroshi's name became more associated with the scandal, Amara's became a symbol of hope. The way she had stood by him, risking everything to fight for justice, inspired others to do the same. It wasn't just about Hiroshi anymore. It was about the system they were up against, a system that had allowed the powerful to thrive while the rest of the world suffered in silence. As the pressure mounted, Hiroshi knew that the only way to bring the corrupt people down was to go after them with everything they had. He couldn't just rely on the media or public outrage. He needed to take direct action. With Amara's help, he began to organize a campaign that would shine a light on the people behind the scandal and expose their connections. But even as they worked tirelessly, Hiroshi knew there was more at stake than just his reputation. The very fabric of his company was on the line. The investors, the partners, and the people who had once stood by him were now questioning everything. He was no longer the CEO they once admired. And yet, in the midst of all the chaos, Hiroshi felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, he wasn't fighting for money or status. He wasn't fighting to protect his empire. He was fighting for something bigger: justice. He had seen the effects of the corruption firsthand, and he was no longer willing to let it continue. With Amara by his side, he felt like he could take on the world. They were no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for change. As the campaign gained momentum, the pressure from the people they were exposing grew stronger. They started receiving anonymous threats, their lives becoming more and more dangerous. But Hiroshi and Amara weren't afraid. They knew that the truth was more powerful than any threat. The more they revealed, the more the public rallied behind them. People were demanding accountability, and the corrupt system that had allowed the powerful to exploit others was finally starting to crack. And then, in a twist of fate, Hiroshi received a call late one evening. It was from a former associate, someone who had been involved in the scandal but had remained silent up until now. The person on the other end of the line had information that could be the key to taking down the entire network. Hiroshi's heart raced as he listened to the details. The pieces were falling into place, and the end was in sight. But the risk was immense. If they moved too quickly, they could lose everything. If they moved too slowly, they might miss their chance. Hiroshi knew the stakes. But this was the moment that would define everything. With Amara's guidance, he made the decision. They would move forward with the plan. Together, they would expose the final pieces of the puzzle and bring those responsible to justice. The battle was far from over, but with each passing day, they were getting closer to the truth. The day Hiroshi and Amara had been anticipating arrived, but the tension in the air was palpable. They had spent weeks preparing, gathering the final pieces of evidence, and making sure everything was in place for the final strike. Now, it was time to take action. The call they had received from a former associate had been a game changer. The information he provided was crucial. It was the missing link in the web of corruption that had been plaguing Hiroshi's company and life. With this final piece of the puzzle, Hiroshi and Amara knew they could bring down the network once and for all. But they also knew they couldn't do it alone. The people they were up against had power, connections, and resources. If they were going to succeed, they would need the support of the public and the right allies. They had already garnered significant public support, but the next steps were even more critical. The plan was simple yet dangerous. They would leak the final piece of evidence, showing the full extent of the corruption, on the eve of a major business summit where the key figures involved would be attending. Hiroshi's heart raced as he prepared to send the evidence to the press, knowing that once it was out, there would be no turning back. The timing had to be perfect. If they acted too early, they risked the evidence being buried. If they waited too long, they risked losing their momentum. But Hiroshi and Amara were in sync. They had trusted each other throughout this journey, and now, they were ready to take the final step. That evening, as they sat together in Hiroshi's office, the last pieces of the plan were falling into place. Hiroshi reviewed the evidence one last time, double-checking the files to ensure everything was in order. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Amara nodded, her expression resolute. "We've come this far. We've already taken everything from them. Now we take their power." Hiroshi took a deep breath and pressed the button to release the evidence. Within seconds, the first article was live. The details were explosive. It revealed the full extent of the conspiracy, implicating the highest-ranking individuals in the company, including several powerful investors and board members. The story spread like wildfire, and within minutes, the media was flooded with coverage. Hiroshi knew that they had just crossed the point of no return. The powerful figures who had once controlled everything were now exposed. The truth was out, and there was no hiding it. As the hours passed, the fallout began. The key figures in the scandal were forced to resign, their names dragged through the mud. The public, once skeptical, began to rally behind Hiroshi and Amara. People were talking. The tide was turning. But just as they thought they had won, the unexpected happened. Hiroshi's phone buzzed late that night. It was a message from his former associate. "They know. They're coming after you. Be careful." Hiroshi's blood ran cold. Despite the public victory, their enemies weren't done. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in weeks, Hiroshi felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: control. It wasn't the same kind of control he had once relied on, the kind that came with wealth and influence, but something deeper. This was the control that came with knowing they had done the right thing. Amara looked at him, her eyes steady as always. "We can't stop now," she said quietly. "We finish this, no matter what." Hiroshi nodded, feeling the weight of their decision settle into him. He knew the danger they faced, but he also knew they had already come too far to turn back. The battle for justice was only beginning, and there was no telling where it would end. But one thing was certain: they would fight together, and they would not be silenced. As the night wore on, the world outside was changing. The rich and powerful who had once ruled with impunity were now facing the consequences of their actions. And Hiroshi, once the man in charge of an empire, was now a man fighting for the truth. It was no longer about protecting his wealth or status. It was about something bigger than all of that: justice. And with Amara by his side, he knew that no matter what came next, they would keep moving forward. The fight was just beginning, and they would not stop until the truth prevailed. As the days passed, Hiroshi and Amara watched as their efforts began to take root. The scandal that had rocked the foundations of Hiroshi's company continued to spread, and with each new revelation, the people who had once pulled the strings behind the scenes were forced into the spotlight. The executives who had been involved in the corruption were either removed from their positions or faced criminal charges. The company's investors, once loyal to Hiroshi, began to withdraw their support, but in its place, a new wave of allies came forward. These were people who had long been silent, but now, with the truth laid bare, they knew they had to act. Hiroshi was no longer a man fighting for his wealth or his position. He was fighting for the future of his company, and more importantly, for the integrity that had been lost. He felt the weight of every decision he had made, but he also felt a new sense of freedom. The burden of his past mistakes was heavy, but the journey he had taken with Amara had led him to a place of redemption. It was a place where the truth mattered more than anything else. Meanwhile, Amara's role in everything had become undeniable. She had been the quiet force behind the scenes, the one who had guided Hiroshi through the darkest moments. She had taken on the burden of not just fighting for herself, but for a system that had failed her, and for people like her who had been ignored for too long. Amara had not only exposed the lies, but had also inspired countless others to stand up and demand change. Her story had gone viral, and now, people were reaching out to her for guidance, for hope. The media, once critical of her, now hailed her as a symbol of strength and resilience. As the story continued to unfold, the full extent of the corruption was exposed, and the network that had operated in the shadows for so long began to collapse. The truth, once suppressed, was now impossible to deny. Hiroshi and Amara knew their fight was far from over. They had uncovered a system of power that stretched far beyond their expectations. Yet, the more they dug, the more they realized that their efforts had sparked something much bigger than just the fall of a few corrupt individuals. People everywhere were starting to question the system, and for the first time in a long time, the powerful were beginning to fear accountability. Despite all the progress, Hiroshi's victory wasn't without cost. He had lost friends, colleagues, and even family members who couldn't bear the weight of the scandal. His reputation had been shattered, but in its place, he had found something far more important: his integrity. As the pressure continued to mount, Hiroshi found himself at a crossroads. He had been a CEO once, a man who held the reins of a powerful empire, but now, he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be going forward. With Amara by his side, Hiroshi knew that his journey was far from over. But now, he was ready to face the future with a sense of purpose he had never known before. In the end, it wasn't about the money or the power. It was about something more lasting, changing the system, changing the way people viewed power and justice. And together, Hiroshi and Amara had set a precedent that would not be easily erased. They had brought down the corrupt, exposed the lies, and in doing so, had given people the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. Hiroshi stood in the ruins of his old life, looking at the wreckage with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had lost everything he once thought mattered, but in that loss, he had found something far more valuable: redemption. Amara, standing beside him, nodded as if she understood everything he was thinking. She had helped him see beyond the surface, to see the truth that lay beneath it all. And now, together, they would continue to fight for that truth. Their story was just beginning, and they would keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles ahead. With the power of truth on their side, they knew they could never be silenced again.